All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of year. Week one of the 2024 NFL season kicks off Thursday night between the Ravens and the Chiefs, which will officially mark week one of the 2024 fantasy football season. And we are here to go through every single matchup and every relevant wide receiver. So many choices, probably the deepest position on every fantasy roster. But we are going to tell you every wide receiver you should be starting and every wide receiver you should be sitting and or potentially just throwing in your flex spot. So let's not waste any time. Let's hop right into our starts and sits for wide receivers for week one of the 2024 fantasy football season. All right, and the good news is here, if you have any of the wide receivers on the screen, you are running right into the sunset with these guys. They are absolute, no doubt, must starters. Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, JJ, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, Devontae Adams, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel, and Mike Evans. If you have these guys, regardless of if it was due to matchup or where you drafted them or because they are just absolute studs, they're in your starting lineup. Let's move right along. All right, Thursday night, we're going to have a great matchup between the Ravens and the Chiefs. Two teams with good defenses, two teams with good offenses, two teams with stud quarterbacks. But let's talk about the wide receivers. Zay Flowers kind of ended the season last year on a down note, basically being one of the main reasons the Ravens lost that AFC Championship game against the same team, the Kansas City Chiefs. But at the end of the day, Zay Flowers had a great rookie season, and towards the second half of the year, he was on an absolute tear. The chemistry with Lamar Jackson was great. You drafted him too high to not start him, even if he's in the flex for you. Zay Flowers, I really like this week here in week one against the Kansas City Chiefs. Rashad Bateman, any other Ravens wide receivers that you might be looking at in deeper formats or dynasty or something, I don't want to start them here in week one. Let's sit back and kind of see if someone emerges. But right now, for me, it's Zay Flowers and no one else in terms of fantasy for the Baltimore Ravens wide receivers. In terms of the Chiefs, yes, we are starting Rashee Rice. And like I kind of ranted about all offseason long, no, he's not going to be suspended this year. He will be out there in week one. He is going to be the pure wide receiver one for the Chiefs. That chemistry from Patrick Mahomes and him is going to roll right into the 2024 season. We know Hollywood Brown's not going to play in this game. So that comes, it brings the question, I should say, what do we do with Xavier Worthy? Because the upside here is massive. It's not a great matchup against the Ravens in week one. But man, I think if you own Xavier Worthy, you don't need to go out of your way to, put him in your lineup against other stud wide receivers, must start guys. But Xavier Worthy in the flex, the upside's too high to not consider it. He's definitely a player I think if you drafted, you can consider him, especially in double flex formats, full PPR formats. He's worth a start this week, but maybe you don't need to go out of your way to do so. Friday night, another stout matchup for fantasy football. We will have the Packers and the Eagles facing off in Brazil. So another two teams, good defenses here, great quarterbacks, lots of wide receivers, good running backs, hopefully lots of fantasy points. Lots of wide receivers to break down here. So for the Packers in the start category, I'm going to say Jaden Reed, fine. You probably drafted him too high. I think he's completely fine to start here in week one. Don't forget, the Eagles had one of the worst secondaries in all of football last year. We'll see if they improved it through the draft and the offseason, but that verdict is still out. So I'm still all in on the Packers wide receivers this week, and that includes Christian Watson, who maybe you're worried about. Maybe you just consider him a flex option. But man, I think the upside is way too high for Watson here in week one. So I'm all in on Watson in week one against the Eagles. And in terms of Romeo Doubs, I think he's fine as a flex. I think it's going to be really interesting. The gamble here is you got just so many good wide receivers on the Packers that, whoever scores a touchdown, although I think you could see more than one touchdown out of this bunch in week one. But whoever scores a touchdown each week is going to be the guy, right? And Dobbs and Jordan Love, a great red zone chemistry. So I still like Dobbs, but you probably drafted him late enough that you don't need to consider him more than a flex. Then Tavion Wicks, preseason hype, great rookie season for the volume that he got. But let's just sit back and see what happens. No need to start him even in deeper formats. In terms of the Eagles, this should be pretty straightforward. Yes, we start A.J. Brown. Yes, we start Devonta Smith week in, week out. Both those guys must start players on a regular basis, regardless of the defense. Jahan Dotson, hey, I mean, this is going to be interesting to see, but he's a pure wide receiver 3. Maybe he gets involved, maybe he surprises us, but until we see it on a regular basis, no reason to start Dotson, even in deeper formats. Moving along to Sunday's slate, let's look at the Steelers and the Falcons. So this should be a pretty easy one to take a look at. We've got Russell Wilson at quarterback for the Steelers. We got Kirk O'Chains at quarterback for the Falcons, so 2 changes there. At the end of the day, George Pickens is the only wide receiver on this team, it feels like. I guess Van Jefferson would be next. You're starting George Pickens. You drafted him to start him, whether it's in the flex, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 4, whatever. You drafted him too high to not start him. I do think this Falcons defense could be kind of stout on Sunday, but the volume's there for Pickens. Freiermuth is the next receiving option on this team. So Pickens, fine. Even with Russ at quarterback, Pickens is fine this week. I still think he brings nice upside to the table, at least. On the other side for the Falcons, yes, we're starting Drake London. You drafted him too high not to start him. The Steelers, good defense, but that secondary was pretty kind to receivers in fantasy football last year. So if you drafted London, you're starting him anyways. I'll go ahead and sit Darnell Mooney. I think he has sneaky flex upside in deeper formats. If you had to start him, I think you could, but I'm talking like 16-team leagues, things like that. I mean, where you drafted him, you probably have no reason to flex him in most leagues this week. So we'll go ahead and sit Darnell Mooney, see if that comes to life or not. But outside of that, Pickens, Lundo, go ahead and start him. All right, moving along, we have got the Cardinals at the Bills, and I'm expecting points in this game. The Bills secondary got weaker throughout the offseason. The Cardinals secondary is still bad. So let's take a look at the wide receivers. Marvin Harrison Jr., where you drafted him, you have to start him. There's no question here. He's, barely didn't make the must start category at the beginning of the video. The only reason I didn't put him in there is because he's a rookie. So you're going to have some people out there like, do I start him? Is he a for sure start? Well, the answer is yes. He's a must start. He's going to get fed. All the volume is going to be there for him. But with that being said, I mean, McBride at tight end is still going to be, part of this equation. And there's 2 other wide receivers that are at least interesting for the Cardinals, and those would be Michael Wilson and Greg the Torch Dortch. But I think that Michael Wilson's the more interesting one out of the 2, and regardless, even in deeper formats, you can't start them here in week 1. So keep an eye on Michael Wilson, especially. I like him maybe to have much more involvement with a fully healthy Kyler this year, but we're not starting him in week 1. In terms of the Bills wide receivers, guys might disagree with this, but I don't feel so good about them in week 1. I don't necessarily feel bad about them going up against the Cardinals at home, but I think there's a lot of risk involved here because you're really touchdown dependent, I think. And I think similar to what we just talked about with the Packers wide receivers, it's like you make the wrong call, you're going to end up with like 6 points in your starting lineup potentially. But I think if you have Keon Coleman, I think he has the most upside. I'm okay with flexing him, but he's kind of like a player to me. I'm okay if you want to roll out in week 1, but mainly this type of situation, I want to sit back and see what happens. I think you can make the same argument to potentially flex Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel. If you want to, you can, but these are all guys where you drafted them that they're probably on your bench. So that's why they really come to sits for me, than kind of a flex, because you just don't need to start any of the Bills wide receivers this week. If you want to, I mean, hey, I still believe in this offense. I believe in Josh Allen. You want to roll the dice, go for it, but I just don't think you need to here in week 1. Next up, we will have the Titans traveling to face the Chicago Bears in a rookie debut for Caleb Williams, sophomore debut for Will Levis. What does that mean for these two offenses and their respective wide receivers? Well, I think you can flex Calvin Ridley. I don't want to put him in the must start category or a start category. You probably drafted him to be a starter in your lineup, but I think you drafted him to be a flex option primarily. So I think this Bears defense going to be okay on Sunday. I'm a little worried about the Titans, although I still think there's upside in this offense and that sophomore year for Will Levis and company. Ridley, for me, a flex. I'm not down on him, but I just don't think he needs to be more than a flex this week. DeAndre Hopkins coming off the injury. We don't actually know at the time recording this if he's going to play or not. He's just a sit for me. You got him later in drafts anyways. No reason that you need to throw D-Hop into your starting lineup, I would hope. In terms of the Bears wide receivers, DJ Moore will get the volume. I am all in on DJ Moore once again this year. You drafted him too high. He's in your starting lineup, whether he's in the flex, he's your wide receiver 2, whatever it is. DJ Moore, start him. The Titans secondary was not good last year, which brings us to Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze, who really interesting. Tough to evaluate this Bears wide receivers room, I will say, because this is a wide receiver room with a lot of options. DJ Moore for sure. Rome Odunze, I think, has some sneaky upside here in week 1. I think him and Caleb Williams going to have a lot of good chemistry. But Keenan Allen is coming off of a monster season last year. I know the preseason wasn't kind to him, but it seems like a lot of fantasy managers is kind of counting him out of the equation here. I think Keenan Allen's still okay to flex. A lot of volume, a lot of mouths to feed. We'll see how it shakes out in week 1. All right, here we go. Game of the week. Patriots at the Bengals. And we were going to get the brisket himself, Jacoby Brissett, throwing to Demario Douglas, Jalen Polk, KJ Osborne, and I don't know. We've heard Thornton. I don't know. We've heard other names in the mix here, but it looks like these are your top 3 wide receivers for the New England Patriots. Somebody might emerge as a consistent fantasy option throughout the season, but we're in week 1. Let's not try and find out in week 1, even against the Bengals defense that is like not that great. Please, for the love of God and all that is good in the world, don't start a Patriots wide receiver, even in deeper formats in week 1. And then we have the easiest wide receiver room to evaluate in the whole NFL, and that would be the Cincinnati Bengals. Yes, you will start Jamar Chase unless he doesn't play, but I think he's going to play. And yes, you will start T. Higgins. Either way, Higgins, I think, is a really sneaky. I mean, I don't want to say sneaky, but I just think he's a great start this week. You know, I think when you look at these two wide receivers, it's like, yes, Chase is the guy. But I think Higgins could end up with a monster game here in week 1. Him and Burrow always seem to have chemistry early and often. So I like Higgins a lot this week. If you own him, he's a great flex option. Chase is still Jamar Chase. And yes, they're not on the screen, but we have 2 interesting rookie wide receivers for the Bengals. Let's kind of sit back. Don't get, too cute here or anything. We don't need to start them even in like dynasty or deeper formats. But Chase, Higgins, yes. The Frankenstein wide receiver room there for the Patriots. Let's just pass, please. All right, moving along, we've got the Texans at the Colts. Anthony Richardson's return. He gets to play at home in week 1. And then on the other hand, CJ Stroud kicking off his sophomore campaign. And you have got some stud wide receivers in this matchup. So for me, I'm starting all the Texans wide receivers. And I think if you drafted Collins, Diggs, or Dell, you are already starting any of these. Like you're not going to bench any of these guys on a regular basis. They all went in the first 3 or 4 rounds, depending on your league size. And there's just no reason, even if you're like a little bit down on Diggs, for example, or you think Dell has injury risk, or you ended up with Collins and you don't feel as good about him as maybe some of the other options that were going at that point in drafts, like whatever it is, you own a Texans wide receiver, you're starting them every week until further notice in week 1. Throw them out there. I love this matchup. I think it's going to be one of those games that we're going to see a lot of good fantasy scoring. In terms of the Colts, Michael Pittman, another guy, week in, week out starter, consistent floor. good matchup here against the Texans, who I do think could be improved defensively this year, but this is still right now a good matchup on paper. Pittman is the true wide receiver one for the Colts, hands down. AD Mitchell, let's sit back, see what happens. Josh Downs, we don't know if he's actually going to play in this game at the time we're recording this, but if he is good to go, let's just sit back on the Colts wide receivers 2 and 3 here. I think either of these guys could be strong candidates to end up in the flex throughout the season, but for now, week 1, let's just sit back and see what happens. All right, next up, we've got one of the more exciting games in week 1 in terms of fantasy potential points. You got the Jaguars at the Dolphins, and I'm actually in the flex boat for these Jaguars wide receivers and Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas Jr., where I think most people might have them as just starts, or at least Kirk as a start here in week 1. But Kirk, coming off that injury that kept him out of the second half of last year, then was a little banged up in the preseason. Looks like he's going to be good to go week 1. He's still the true wide receiver 1 for the Jaguars. Great PPR option. Guy who's always consistent, but I think here in week 1, where you drafted him, he just isn't in that flex category for me. Not out on him, think he's a good flex option, but I just don't think you need to go out of your way to put him in as like your wide receiver 2 or anything. Then Brian Thomas Jr., I think if you drafted him, you like him, you want to roll the dice here in week 1, you probably did draft him because you believe in him in terms of being a consistent fantasy option this year. I think here in week 1, you're in as good of a spot to flex him as possible because this is going to be a high-scoring affair between the Jags and the Dolphins. So if you want to start Kirk or B-Tom in the flex, I'm all for it. In terms of Gabe Davis, he might have 50 points, might have 30, might have 6, might have 0. It's Gabe Davis. I don't know. We'll see. I think you have to be in a really deep format to even consider him. So I'm going to say Gabe Davis is a sit. In terms of the Dolphins, this is going to be one of the easiest wide receiver rooms to take a look at on a weekly basis. You will start Tyreek Hill no matter what, and you will start Jalen Waddle no matter what. Malik Washington could be interesting to watch. Odell Beckham's on the pup list, but no reason to start Malik Washington, rookie wide receiver, here in week 1. All right, another divisional matchup coming up here. The Panthers at the Saints, the battle of Bryce Young and Derek Carr. We'll see what that means for these wide receivers in fantasy. Kind of a tough matchup here for Deontay Johnson, theoretically, but I think all the volume's going to be there for Deontay. We're going to find out why he's going to be a great PPR option throughout the whole season. This passing offense will be improved with Dave Canales as their head coach this year. So, yes, if you own Deontay Johnson, you might just be flexing him, but I'm completely fine with him being a starter here in week 1. Xavier Leggett, Adam Thielen, I'm not quite there, even in deeper formats. Let's just sit back, see what happens, see if these guys have enough volume throughout the year. But Deontay Johnson, to me, clear-cut wide receiver 1 for the Panthers. We are starting him and benching the rest. In terms of the Saints, yes, you will start Chris Olave. You drafted him way too high to not start him, either when in the second or third round, depending on your league size and all that. And the Panthers, believe it or not, were actually pretty dang good against opposing wide receivers in fantasy last year, but I'm not worried about it. Chris Olave, you are rolling out at home in week 1, without a doubt. Rashid Shaheed, always interesting upside, but where you drafted him, we don't need to find out in week 1 if he's going to bring a high ceiling or not in your starting lineup. If you have him, he's fine on the bench, but let's not throw him into starting lineups in week 1. All right, and then we've got the much anticipated battle between Sam Darnold and Daniel Jones. We'll see how that affects the wide receivers for the Vikings and the Giants, but easy start here is Justin Jefferson. I don't care if Nathan Peterman gets signed to the Vikings and is named the starter. We will still start Justin Jefferson every week in fantasy football. Jordan Addison, I have as a flex because at the moment, it looks like he's going to play in week 1, and it looks like he's not going to be suspended. If you're worried about the suspension, well, by the time, Sunday rolls around, we should know if that's going to happen or not. At the moment, doesn't look like it's happening. If you're worried about the ankle injury, if he suits up and you drafted him, I think he's fine to flex this week because this Giants secondary was awful last year. So I think that Sam Darnold and Kevin O'Connell offense, they're going to throw the football. I think Addison's okay. Some people are viewing him as a like must sit player or player that's only going to be valuable down the stretch in the season or whatever. But right now, if you own Addison, he's not suspended and he suits up, you can throw him in your flex. Don't forget, he still had a great rookie season once we get past the off the field stuff and the ankle injury. Great fantasy player last year. So, in terms of the Giants, interesting wide receiver room here, but we got rookie Malik Neighbors. Listen, you drafted Neighbors, you're starting him, whether he's your wide receiver 2, whether he's your second flex, whether you're in full PPR or standard. If you drafted Neighbors, you believe in Neighbors, and I think we all believe in Neighbors. We just maybe don't believe in Danny Dimes throwing him the footballs. So Malik Neighbors, fine this week, and it's a good matchup at home against the Vikings secondary. Wendell Robinson, Darius Slayton, maybe some hidden upside there. I could see either of these guys actually having a decent game, but I mean, I don't want to find out in my starting lineup in week 1, so they're both going to come in as sits for me. All right, next up, we have got Gardner Minshew and company traveling to the now Jim Harbaugh led LA Chargers, and a couple interesting wide receivers here. So Devontae made the must-start list at the beginning of the video. I still think he's a must-start on a weekly basis. Wide receiver 10 last year. Yes, the noodle arm, Minshew Mania will be throwing to him, but I don't really care until we see a complete fall off for Adams. No reason to not start him. You still drafted him in the second, maybe third round in your draft. Anyways, Jacoby Myers, interesting upside, good bench option, might be a viable flex option this year. Do you think the routes that he's used to running will mesh well with what Gardner Minshew likes to do, which is get the ball out quick and to short routes? But let's sit back and see what happens and leave him on the bench. In terms of the Chargers wide receivers, this is going to be a really interesting offense to evaluate in week 1. Run heavy offense. Herbert, coming off the foot injury, is not going to be super mobile. So I don't know how I feel about them in week 1, even against the Raiders defense. I am okay with flexing Josh Palmer in like deeper formats. I kind of view him as the wide receiver at least the most red zone upside, touchdown upside of the bunch. So I'm okay with Palmer, but I'm not going to go out of my way to throw him in my starting lineup. I still like Ladd McConkey on the season. I think he's a good PPR option, the slot guy here. But rookie wide receiver, week 1, weird situation. I don't want to start him. And where you drafted him, you probably just don't need to. Quentin Johnston, for the love of all that is good left in the world, please, even in deep, deep formats, do not start Quentin Johnston. Moving along, we've got the Broncos at the Seahawks. This is an interesting bunch here. A lot of wide receivers to break down. I'm still flexing Cortland Sutton. I think he's a solid flex. All the volume should be there. The question is, what does this Broncos offense look like in Bo Nix's first start on the road? It might not be great. Look good in the preseason, but these are real starters. Like I said, on the road, I think the Seahawks defense gonna be up for the match here, but Cortland Sutton's still a solid flex option if you need to throw him in, especially in double flex formats. I do like Sutton this week. Marvin Mims, I don't think any reason that you need to start him or any other Broncos wide receiver. Let's kind of see what the offense looks like, what Bo Nix looks like, what the volume looks like if someone else emerges. But for now, it's just Cortland Sutton for me. In terms of the Seahawks, another interesting situation here. Broncos secondary is not awful. They're not great. You got Pat Surtain lurking around. I would imagine he's going to be on Metcalf most of this game, but Metcalf, one of those wide receivers, it doesn't really matter what corner he's going against. You just have to start him, and you drafted him too high to not start him. So Metcalf, still a start for me. JSN, Tyler Lockett, I could see either of these guys like having like 14-ish points this week, or having like 6 points this week, or maybe having 2 touchdowns this week. So I just don't want to risk it in my starting lineup in week 1. If I had to risk it, I'd probably risk JSN, but let's just kind of sit back and see what this, sophomore season for JSN looks like, what this late season in his career for Tyler Lockett looks like, and what this offense looks like as a whole. For now, I only really feel good about DK Metcalf. Next on the list, we will have the Cowboys traveling to Cleveland to face the Browns. And CeeDee Lamb is under contract. Nothing to worry about here. He is the wide receiver one for the Cowboys. He was the wide receiver one in fantasy football last year, and he is your wide receiver one. If he is on your fantasy football team, he is a must start every single week. Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert. I don't want to get cute here. Cooks, maybe in like a really deep format if you have to flex him. Sure, but I don't want to underestimate this Browns defense at home. I don't really feel good about Cooks and or Tolbert, even in way deep formats. So they're going to come in as sits for me. Amari Cooper for the Browns, I am still starting. You drafted him too high, even if he's in your flex. Yes, you're starting him. This Cowboys secondary was good last year. Wasn't very kind to opposing wide receivers in fantasy football, but Coop is still a start, essentially on a week in, week out basis. And please do not start Jerry Jeudy. I just do not. I know in some leagues he got drafted, but I just don't feel good about Jerry Jeudy whatsoever. And I know there's some other names in terms of other potential Browns wide receivers like Cedric Tillman, Elijah Moore. Don't start any of those guys. They don't need to be in your lineup in week one. All right, next on the list, we will have the Washington Commanders traveling to face the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And yes, Terry McLaurin himself will be a start week in and week out until further notice because he is the true wide receiver one for the Washington Commanders. And, this Bucs defense, not awful necessarily last year, but the secondary was not good. Terry's going to get a ton of volume. I don't even know who the wide receiver two here for the Commanders is going to be. The preseason kind of made it look like it might be Brown. And then we started to get all these rumblings about Luke McCaffrey. Either way, don't get too cute here. Or maybe one of those two guys stumbles into the end zone, or maybe someone else on this team at wide receiver does. But Scary Terry, really the only true wide receiver we can consider in fantasy football in week one. In terms of the Buccaneers wide receivers, you may have noticed that Mike Evans made the must-start list at the beginning of the video, and that is because the Commanders had one of the absolute worst secondaries in all of football last year. So I love Mike Evans this week. He's a must-start for me, and Chris Godwin, if you drafted him, I think is also a must-start, and I like both of these wide receivers enough that I would head straight over to Underdog Fantasy and take the over. I mean, you can really choose here. Mike Evans over 67.5 receiving yards, or Chris Godwin over 57.5 receiving yards, or if you're feeling extra spicy, either of these wide receivers to score a touchdown. And new customers, when you use promo code The Catch, that link is down below and on the screen, will receive a free pick'em for this week, which will be Travis Kelce to have over half a receiving yard. Take one of these Bucs wide receivers, one of their overs, pair that with that Travis Kelce free pick'em, and on top of that, new customers will also get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you use promo code The Catch, up to $1,000 in bonus cash to use on Underdog Fantasy. Pair those two pick'ems together. Before you know it, you can buy your own Mike Evans jersey heading into week one. Outside of Mike Evans or Chris Godwin, I don't think we need to start Jalen McMillan. Had a good preseason. Could certainly be utilized in this offense, but he's still a rookie wide receiver. No reason to start him in week one. It's Sunday Night Football, probably the best game of the week. We'll find out. But regardless, we got the Rams heading to Detroit to take on the Lions. We got Matthew Stafford's second revenge bowl, potentially. Either way, we have a ton of good wide receivers to go over in this matchup. I mean, I really think you can make an argument for going into deep leagues. You can start any of these players on the screen. But let's start with the studs for the Rams, Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp in your starting lineup until further notice. Great matchup against the Lions. The secondary awful last year. We'll see if they improved enough through the offseason and the draft. I think if they did, it's not going to be on case in week one against Puka and Cooper Kupp. Demarcus Robinson, a late round draft pick that I have been very vocal about throughout the offseason that I really, really like, but I'm not going to start him in week one where you drafted him. Just no reason to do so. Jordan Whittingham started to kind of come in contention for that wide receiver 3 role for the Rams, and maybe he takes over Demarcus Robinson as the season goes on. He had a great preseason, great training camp, so Two names to definitely pay attention to in Robinson and Whittingham in a pass-heavy offense, but no reason to start either of those guys in week one. Amon-Ra St. Brown, nothing to say here. Could be the wide receiver one in all of fantasy this year. You're starting him, even if he's facing the 2000 Ravens mixed with the 1985 Bears. He's in your starting lineup. Jameson Williams, very interesting play here. I do think he's a solid flex option. The Rams, we kind of look at this team and you kind of think defense. This defense was not good last year, and they're not going to be great this year. They're going to be really reliant on that offense to get them through each week. Jameson Williams, I think, a really sneaky play. Don't forget, towards the end of the season last year and through the playoffs, a great chemistry between Jared Goff and J-Mo. So I do think if you are in a position where you feel like you have to flex Jameson Williams, it's fine, but you don't necessarily need to go out of your way to do so. Last but not least, Monday Night Football, we will have the Jets and hopefully a game where Aaron Rodgers plays more than one snap facing off against the San Francisco 49ers. So certainly an interesting matchup. Some studly wide receivers here for both teams. Garrett Wilson, regardless of what team he's going up against, will be in your starting lineup. I expect a good game out of Garrett Wilson in this matchup where Aaron Rodgers should theoretically be healthy and everything and not get injured for the entire season or in this game. Let's all cross our fingers. But Wilson going to get that volume. The touchdown upside is completely expedited with Rodgers healthy. So love Garrett Wilson this week. Mike Williams, I'm going to say, is a sit. Looks like he's going to be ready to go week one, but let's kind of sit back and see what happens, how he's utilizing this offense. What's the chemistry with Rodgers like? Is he actually fully healthy? Mike Williams was on a great pace last year before he got hurt early in the season. When Mike Williams plays, he's great. The problem is, is he actually going to be healthy? So let's just sit him for now. No reason to start him. Malachi Corley, been an interesting name throughout the offseason, but no reason to start the rookie here in week one, even in deeper formats. Then the Niners, one of the easiest teams to evaluate week in, week out basis. Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, both in your starting lineup, even against a good, stout Jets secondary. Way too good of players to not start in week one. And there you guys have it. There are your starts and sits at the wide receiver position for every matchup for week one of the 2024 fantasy football season. If you guys have any questions in regards to week one of the fantasy season, drop them in the comments down below. Wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, quarterbacks, kickers, defenses, trades, starts, sits, whatever it is, whatever format, drop them down below. We will get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And of course, let us know what wide receivers you were rolling with as you head into week one of the season. And with that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, we saw it here on The Catch.